Documents on the table.
You're looking for that?
That's what they're talking about right there.
Yeah, that's the knockout cell table.
You have to keep referring to that chart.
Oh, yeah, well, see, James Millen didn't believe in a graduated dial because it didn't produce accurate enough graduated dial. It was an easy ending, but,
What is this, band spread adjustment?
well, yeah, it's a band spread chart adjustment.
Yeah, it could be.
It was a 30, I'm trying to think, it was 3155 and 7110, I think.
He listed the different airlines that were in his area in the Midwest, like
Yeah.
and the doghouse. You will go to supply.
Yeah, there it is.
Right there.
There it is.
This is an ad for what? I'm sorry. Right.
Systems, they didn't have a mixture of all kinds of stuff. So they had control of
You
all
saw
of it.
the picture of him on one of the slides. On the receiver or whatever.
Oh, yeah.
This doesn't need to be here.
With an aluminum front panel. See the construction of it.
Did you ever hear the story about
They were famous
for the airways? They bought a whole bunch of HROs, put them on.
Oh, yeah, on poles.
Put them onto the telephone.
Yeah, I did. Those things were just running nonstop. I think about every 50 miles they had an HRO set. Yeah, on telephone poles.
You don't press that information.
No, that's amazing, isn't it? Yeah, that's amazing.
I started getting excited about the idea of having a session on HROs and HRO clones. I had just met Leonard Hunter up in Pittsburgh, and he had some Japanese and German HROs, and Wayne had found a few HROs, and I found a couple, and I said, we should do a session. Of course, I'm not doing the session. William's doing the session. So anyway, I want to apologize for William, but I did help him with the slides, so hopefully that's something. So I hope you forgive me, William.
Brian reminds me of the kind of guy that gets two people started fighting and then leaves. I haven't confirmed this with a psychiatrist, but I think I'm partly enamored to these old boat anchors because they remind me of my youth, and I need a lot of reminding these days. I hope I won't have a senior moment while I'm doing this. At least if I do, it won't be as bad as the guy I heard about a couple of days ago. This elderly man and woman were visiting neighbors for dinner. And after dinner, the wives went in the next room and the guys were talking, and the visitor told them about a terrific restaurant they'd been to the night before and what a wonderful meal they'd had. And the host said, well, what was the name of the restaurant? We might like to go there. And the visitor said, I can't remember. He said, what's the name of the flower that's real pretty and husbands give to their wives and they smell good and they have thorns on them? And the host said, oh, you mean a rose? He said, yeah. Hey, Rose, what was the name of that restaurant? Try not to have any of that. My first hearing of an HRO, I guess, was when I was in the 8th grade. I visited an old timer, and he was, I won't say he was affluent, he was at least upper middle class, and he had plenty of money to spend on his toys. This would have been 1946 or 7. Yeah, BC 610 and SX28 and SP400. And I asked him how he liked the receivers, and he said, well, I don't like the SX28. SP400's okay. I said, well, what do you really like? He said, well, I wish they hadn't gotten rid of my HRO. And at that time, that would have been the HRO5. But over the years, I never saw very many HROs. I was lucky enough to get an SP200 when I was still in high school, and I'd see them at Hamfest, but the HROs were scarce. But in the last 3 years, I've kind of fallen in love with them. A little bit about National Company. In the early 1900s, 1900 to 1920, power stations were a growth industry. And the big company that designed and built power stations was in Boston. That was Stone and Webster. There were 3 engineers at Stone and Webster that saw a need for peripherals. The big guys, GE and Westinghouse and Alice Chalmers, built the big alternators and the steam engines. But there were a lot of little things that went on a power station that weren't readily available. So they started this little company making peripherals and were very successful at it. Only problem was the power station took a long time to build, and they were having slack time in the factory trying to keep the employees busy. And one of the 3 partners needed a buyer at the F.W. Woolworth Company, dime store chain, and he prevailed upon his friend at Woolworth to give them some orders for some rather unique toys that they could make, and that worked out pretty good. And then in about 1920, building radio receivers was another growth industry, and the Allen D. Cardwell Company supplied most of the variable capacitors that we used in factory-made receivers as well as kits. And the representative for Cardwell lived, one of them anyway, lived in Boston, and Cardwell had so many orders they couldn't fill them, so this salesman was on commission and he couldn't make as much money as he thought he should be making, so he went to these 3 guys at National and asked them if they could make variable capacitors. And they talked about it. They had the machinery and the skill of labor to do it, so they got into the capacitor business. That was their first radio component. Well, this led to everybody was making radios, so they decided they'd try their hand, but they didn't get into the mass consumer market. They got into the short communications receivers, shortwave specialty receivers. After they started making the toys, I don't know that they had much of a name before, I don't know what it was, but they became the National Toy Company. And after radio components, they dropped the toy from the name and just changed it to National Company. And it wasn't the National Company, it wasn't National Radio Company or National Electronics, it was just National. They made the SW3 and SW5 and FB7 and the first receiver on the end. The AGS, which made it, probably was the best receiver in its day. The only competition I think it would have had was the Hammerman Comet Pro. And FB7, which was basically an AGS. Than the AGS, a low noise floor, plug-in coil. One of the problems with all of the HRO was the shop order was. Brian would appreciate it if you'd tell him of any you know available. Which, well, the dial was supposed to roll in round cans. They didn't last too long. So that's a sign of an early one, but they did last beyond shop orders D and E. That is the crystal filter box, and that is chromium-plated crystal, plug-in crystal. And if you are buying an HRO that has the external crystal socket, make sure it has the crystal plugged in. This is the first RF amp, the capacitor section that goes with that. That's the second RF amp. That's the mixer and the oscillator. And the serial number for these old ones is between the antenna terminal right here and the edge of the chassis. The first shop orders, maybe the first 5 or 6 or 7, had 4 rows of relatively small ventilating holes in the back. And the ends of the cabinet didn't have any ventilating holes, no louvers. Now there's a little better picture of the NC Diamond pointer and a close-up of the German silver-plated dial. There's the meter and the pearl button switch. That switch, incidentally, is a doorbell button. I found that out when my doorbell stopped working. I went to Lowe's and that's what I found. There's the serial number right there. And there's a little better view. See the crystal right there. Oh, and a lot of the receivers, not all of them, but a lot of them had holes punched in the chassis down here for installation of an audio transformer. This radio normally came without an audio transformer, which might have been fairly common back then. But if you bought an off-the-shelf HRO and the speaker, the output transformer is in the speaker. This is the tuning assembly from a Super Pro. And I put this in here just to show you the complexity of the Hammerman radio as compared to the HRO. You can see the variable capacitor under here. It has, there are 4 sections just like in the HRO, but each section is divided up into 2 or 3, and they had to switch those sections in order to get the band spread to cover the right amount of the dial as you change frequency. This thing was a mechanical nightmare. They do work pretty good. With the HRO, if you had all 9 coil sets, you could go from 50 kilohertz to 30 megahertz. With the HRO, for some reason, the way Hammerman set them up, you had to have 3 separate HRO, 3 separate Super Pros to cover the same frequency range. Although you would get up to 40 megacycles, but you didn't get down to 50. You only started at 100. Not that it's all that important, but it might have been for the people like the FAA. There's D34 up here on the table. You can see the coil has the white background on the graph. There's underneath the chassis of an HRO that had a black chassis, first few shop orders. You can see every part in there without moving. I think you could actually replace every part without having to do anything more than scoot some other part over a little bit. I don't know if you've ever worked on the bottom of a KWM2, but it's quite a contrast to this. You go crazy trying to get down to the 3rd layer of parts. This is the BFO frequency adjuster, and there's a toggle switch right there and a lever that's put on the shaft that actuates that toggle switch. And I wanted to point out that if you're looking at what you think is an HRO Junior. If you can see that, there are two clues that it might not be a junior, it might be a Navy RAS or other military receiver. And the military version that had the low frequency IF, 175 kilohertz instead of 456, that variable capacitor has about 10 plates on the rotor and 10 plates on the stator to swing the frequency far enough at the lower IF frequency. One of the criteria for the new receiver was that it should have good shielding, and you notice the coils have 4 separate aluminum cans, shield cans for the circuitry for the first, second RF oscillator and the mixer. Well, this is where the coils went. That was the drawer that the coils slide into. And these spot weld marks here are they hold the separations between the coils. So you had not only the shielding of the individual coil cans, you had the shielding within the coil storage unit. So the shielding between the different circuits was just almost perfect. If you're looking at an HRO to buy, you can find the shop order, which is on the old ones, the letter, the prefix before the number over between the antenna terminal and the chassis where I showed you. You can look in this chart and tell when it was made.
How about that last one you just got off eBay? That last one, A130.
Yeah, I just bought one that had a weird, had an A, which I knew it wasn't. It didn't come out of the old shop orders, but it had an A and 3 numerals, and it wasn't in that place. And I found out, I think from Radio Boulevard, that some of the Canadian receivers had weird non-conforming serial numbers.
We can check that one. It just showed up today.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll check that.
Okay, so far we've seen the pearl button S-meter switch change, and they went from the pearl button to a push-pull switch. Kind of unusual. The chassis paint was changed from black to gray. German silver dials ended in 1936. The rear vent holes were enlarged. We'll see a picture of that sooner or later. And they went to larger ventilating holes in the back, and it's difficult to see here, but they put louvers in the ends of the cabinets. There's the gray paint on the chassis. And you can see here's a coil with a black background with a white lettering on the black. And there's the non-German silver-plated dial. And they changed to a plastic case for the S-meter and a translucent dial with a light behind it. Incidentally, the first few shop orders didn't even have a pilot light, so you couldn't, and the power supply didn't have a pilot light, so the only way you could tell if it was on was to listen to it or feel it and see if it was warm. Here's like a D through probably a G or H shop order at the round cans, but this one, National was real good about modifying your radio. If you had one you wanted brought up to date, they were very reasonable and pleasant about doing it. So here's one that belonged to F.E. Handy, who was the communications manager at the ARRL from like 1929 to 1955 or later. I remember seeing his name in the front of the QST for years. Anyway, he had them replace the round transformers, and they added the noise limiter, which only came along at the suffix -1. The 5A didn't have a noise limiter, the 5A1 had the noise limiter. But they put a little sub-chassis in that had the 6H6 and the 6J5, which made up the noise limiter. He also had his old-fashioned S meter changed to one that had dB over S9. All those old meters were 1 to 5, like R5, and then when the S system came along and went to 9, I guess the people thought they needed to upgrade to the newer system. So somewhere my meter's out there waiting for me to find it. There's a new meter. And there's the push-pull switch that was used to turn the S meter on and off. I don't know why they did it, but they've got an S meter switch all the way up to the bitter end of the old black radios. I don't know about the 50s and HRO 50s and 60s. It's shop order J. I think they added the rings around the AVC switch on the left and the B plus switch on the right. And some of the radios, and maybe even many of them during World War II, were shipped with a meter that was 0 to 1 milliamp instead of having an S meter scale on it. So if you find a prospective buy, you might think that it doesn't have the right S meter, but the fact of the business is it could have come out of the factory that way. And I think almost all of them that went to England had a 1 milliamp meter. Incidentally, before the ID rings on these two switches, there was no labeling of the controls on the panel, except on the panels for relay rack mounting. The label was on the skirt of the knobs, like audio gain, OSBFO, and that was audio gain, RF gain, and the crystal filter. And finally, they replaced the push-pull knob with a ball handle toggle switch that was just like the other two toggle switches. This is an HRO Junior. James Millen was real good to go around and visit the ham clubs, and was very pleasant to communicate with. If you wrote him a letter, he'd write back to you. And a lot of hams asked him, well, they said, look, we don't need a crystal filter, and we don't have to have an S meter, and we don't have to have band spread. How about making a radio without those 3 items and sell it to us for less money? Because it was in the Depression, and money was pretty tight. So he came up with the HRO Junior, and this is one of them. You can see it's missing the crystal filter knobs over here, no S meter. And the coil only has 1 graph, which indicates it doesn't have the band spread capability. There's an ad, probably out of QST, $99. Get your HRO Junior. Henceforth, after this, they call the real HRO HRO Senior. But it was not really officially called a senior. You won't find a name badge with senior on it. You won't find any, I don't think you'll find an instruction book that has the word senior in it. And I'm not sure there are any advertisements with the word senior, but it was popularly called a senior. Now this is a military radio. I think there's a better view here somewhere. This has the appearance of an HRO Junior. No crystal filter over here, no S meter, and the coil was some they have funny looking coil. But this is a military version, except it has a 175 kilohertz IF instead of a 456. And the coils had, I guess they thought they were going to use them on ships or tanks or something. They had a lever that would lock the coil into position, and I think you would actually extract it when you pull it out, when you pull the lever up to get the coil out so you could change it. Some of them still will, if you find one that might have a nameplate, but very often the military stuff, they take the nameplates off and they surplus them. And that's a military power supply. Looks a lot like that one, but Greg says it's not the same power supply. And if you're fortunate, it'll have all the coils with it, have a nice coil storage rack to go with it.
They don't work in a regular HRO, right?
Oh, right, good point. If you have an HRO and you need, say, the broadcast band coils, and you find coils on eBay, for instance, make sure they're not RAS coils, because they will not work in an HRO because of the difference in the IF frequency. They'll plug in. I bought one off eBay, and this is the voice of experience.
Now, have you ever seen a real HRO Junior?
No.
Because the one, like the last 3 or 4 I've seen on eBay are actually
Right.
RASs.
Yeah, military.
Yeah.
I don't think there were very many of them made. When you looked at the price, that was $99, but by the time you converted to band spread and you had national ad, the S meter and the crystal filter, you were probably up over the cost of the HRO. So it was a bad deal. These are Brian's. I don't know, he's greedy, I guess. He got 3 of them in that picture.
They just come in, they come in pairs,
They just follow you home.
What was the idea of using that low IF frequency like that?
The Navy wanted to be able to copy down in that region where the IF, the 456, on the regular HRO, you can't tune very close to 456 because you pick up the internal oscillator.
500 was the emergency frequency.
And the HRO actually goes to 500, but it's at the stop on the dial, and I guess they wanted something that would go a little bit farther down than that. The HRO Junior was $99, and the real McCoy is $167.70. So I can't see the point in buying an HRO Junior. After all these changes up to about this time, the HROs, if you look at a badge on one, it'll say just model HRO. At this point, where they added the ID rings to the switches, and they took the crystal off the top of the crystal filter and put it inside. And to change the meter switch to a ball handle toggle. And maybe one or two minor changes, but at that point it picked up the suffix M and MX, and I didn't spend a lot of time looking, but I can't tell you what the X stands for. You'd think it was crystal, but they all had crystal filters, so I don't know what it was.
So the coil in this picture, the graphs on the left and the right, is what, a logging scale? Is that right?
Yeah, if the coil doesn't have two graphs on it, it means it's not band spread. Now the broadcast band and below didn't have band spread anyway, but what later became the A, B, C, and D coils, which covered 1.7 megahertz to 30 megahertz. If you bought it as an amateur receiver, each one of those four coils had a band spread feature. You had to move 4 screws on the top of the coil to change it from general coverage to band spread, but at least you had it. And but if you're looking at a receiver to buy or a coil on eBay or wherever to buy it, and it doesn't, and it's for regular ham bands, and it doesn't have a graph on the right-hand side, it doesn't have band spread. So don't get caught buying something you don't want. This is an HRO5. After the M, they went to octal tubes, and this was near the end of World War II. And I have not been able to find out why they waited that long to go to octal tubes, because the NC100 had octal tubes, and it was made in about 1937, I think, the first version. So there were octal tubes available for 6 or 7 years before they switched the HRO over. And all I can think of is that during the war they had such a huge backlog of orders, and probably the military had told them they didn't want any screw-ups, so don't be changing. But if it wasn't broke, don't try to fix it. So, but anyway, near the end of the war, they went to the octal tubes, and I don't think there's very much difference in the performance of the radios with the octal tubes and the 6-pin glass tubes. I didn't mention earlier, the original HROs had 2.5 volt glass tubes only. And then later you could get it with equivalent 6 volt tubes. And that was an option for a while. And then I think the standard became the 6 volt, and you could still get the 2.5 volt if for some strange reason you wanted them. And then they just stopped supplying them with 2.5 volt tubes. But if you buy a radio and you don't get the power supply with it, be sure and check the tubes in it before you hook it up to a power supply, because if you hook one that has 2.5 volt tubes up to a 6 volt supply, it'll blow them out so fast you won't have time to turn it off.
Wasn't the 2.5 volt tubes designed for HROs, the early ones for battery operation?
No, not to my knowledge. There was a battery power supply that looked like a doghouse. It ran on 6 volt battery. There might have been one later that ran on 12 volt battery, but it had a vibrator in it, I believe. But it was 6 volts. If you get one that was made for 2.5 volts, the one advantage is the power cord's got a heavier conductor in it for the filaments.
Where did you get the 2.5 volts? Where did they get the 2.5 volts from originally?
Into the power supply.
Power supply.
He's got a slide about it.
Yeah, I'll show you a slide here in a minute. At the HRO5, that was called 5 because they put the optical tubes in it during the war. I guess it was at the end of the war. If it had band spread coils, they called it a 5A if it was civilian. Absolutely no difference in the radio. They called it an HROW if it was military. And the HRO5T was for tabletop, like that one, and the HRO5R was for rack mount. Got a relay rack panel on the front. That one happens to be an HROW, and you can tell because the badge is longer than the regular civilian HRO badge. That one also has, I believe it has a 1 milliamp meter. And about the same time, if they went to the optical tubes, they changed the graphs on the coils to an aluminum plate with a silk screen graph and all the graphics on it. This is a non-band spread. Well, this is a military radio, so it didn't have band spread. But if it's an ABC D coil and it doesn't have band spread, and it has the what we call the white face or silver face, it has a J in front of the letter that designates the band. So be careful if you're buying coils. If it has a J, doesn't have band spread. If it's broadcast band or below, it doesn't matter. They don't have band spread anyway. This is an HROW. Oh, and along the line, as a cost-cutting measure, they changed the gearbox from a casting to a sheet metal, heavy sheet metal box. As far as I know, they reduced the cost, but they didn't have a quality problem when they did that. This has what they call, I don't know if it's official or not, but this yellow tinge is because of MFP, military fungus proofing, moisture proofing, I'm sorry. Kind of distracting, ugly, but of all the ones I've ever seen that had MFP, none of them had any rust in them. So the painted chassis have less rust than the HRO5As that had cadmium plated chassis. But if you're getting one that has the MFP and doesn't have any rust, it probably won't get any rust. You might get tuberculosis from being around it or something. I don't know about that part of it. Here's an HRO5TA1. What did the 1 mean? Oh, that one has band spread coil. That's a D coil. That's 80 meter. The A1 was an A with a noise limiter in it. I don't know if I think I showed a picture earlier. I showed you they added a 6J5 and a 6H6. I think the 6H6 was a series noise limiter or clipper. I forgot what type it is. But I believe they added the 6J5 to pick up a little bit of gain that they lost by putting the noise limiter in. And there were several variations in the A1. One of them was, well, the first one was the noise limiter was added. Pay attention to the way these two knobs look in relation to each other. See, there's a fairly good space in between those knobs. And look at this one. This is an early 5TA1, and it's got a round S meter, and it's got the old crystal filter from the HROW, where they first put the crystal inside the box. In this one, they reverse the position of the knobs, where this was the selectivity on the older one. I think this was this. Anyway, this knob has 6 discrete settings on it. That's the selectivity knob. That's the phasing knob. And on the older one, the selectivity was a variable capacitor. It had an off position that I think operated a little cam that turned it off. But this one is just a 6-position switch, which I kind of like. There's a white face coil, a D band spread, and right there you see a serial number. That's the same serial number that's on the radio. And if you get the radio and it has the same serial number on the coils, that's an indication that that came out of the factory with that set of coils and it was aligned. Those coils were aligned to that particular radio. So I wouldn't turn it down because it didn't have the right serial number, but it'd be nice to get it that way. And be very careful if you're lucky enough to have the coil with the serial number. It's stamped on there with a rubber stamp. And if you rub it, in your zeal to clean up your newfound radio, you take a wet cloth and rub it, it'll rub the serial number right off. You'll see a lot of them that the serial number is either gone or just barely visible, or maybe 1 or 2 numbers are visible. There's an HRO6. That is a beauty. There are 3 things, Brian is telling me 4, which I'll get to. But there are 3 differences in the HRO6 and the HRO5A1. 1 is the name tag. See, it's got 6 right there. Second is the serial number. We only know of 2 of these that were made. And the serial numbers are interspersed with some of the serial numbers of the 5A1s. And the third change was these 2 resistors were added to the noise limiter. And the 4th difference is not listed in the slides, and it is about $3,000 because there are only 2 of these known to be in existence. So what I'm saying is you can buy a nice 5TA1 for $600,000. These will run you probably $3,000 just because of the rarity. A few shortcomings of HROs. In my opinion, they are a very dangerous radio. I don't know if I got another picture here. On the old one, some of these meters have B+ on the adjusting screw. And all of them, as far as I know, have B+ on the S meter adjusting pot back here on the top of the chassis. So you stick your screwdriver down in there to turn it, and you happen to touch the metal part of the screwdriver in the chassis, and you'll find out about it. There's B+ on the rear chassis. There's a send-receive terminal to turn the B+ on and off. And there's B+ on the speaker connection on the back because it has an external output transformer. And it also, if it has the external output transformer, it has B+ in the speaker. So some of the national speaker cords have a grounding wire in it, and you should ground it, whether it has that wire or not. It doesn't add one, because you can get a leak in the transformer and leak the high voltage over to the speaker frame, thence to the cabinet, and get a nasty shock off of it. There is no fuse in the doghouse. there's no grounding lug on the power cord. Of course, there weren't any back then. But in my opinion, boat anchors should have modern power plugs that ground the thing in a grounding convenience outlet. Oh, and the doghouse, didn't we have a picture of the, yeah.
Go back a second and show the two. The
Yeah.
6 volt
Oh,
versus
yeah.
the 2.5.
Yeah, this is the later doghouse. This is an earlier one that was actually made for SW5 or
B7.
SB7. It had 2.5 volts. And if you get a radio and you don't have a power supply and you're buying one on eBay or wherever, just because it's shaped like a doghouse doesn't mean it's going to run your radio. You better check the nameplate because they came in 2.5 volt filament and they came in 180 volts B plus and not enough current to run a HRO. And another thing, this is an early 697 is the model designation of the HRO power supply. And that's the later one. There was no change in the designation, but they added that switch, which will switch it from 115 volts to 230 volts. But you can see in this power supply and in this power supply, the power transformer and the choke are in a blob of tar or wax. I don't know what it is, but I suspect it's very flammable. So between not having a fuse in it and the flammable stuff surrounding the choke and the transformer, I would not go off and leave one of them running, because you might come back with a fire department parked outside your house. And at best, you'd probably smoke up a room and have a big insurance claim for smoke damage.
Go back to the fuse plug, if you would, your favorite.
Oh, yeah. You recognize this and
Throw them away.
that's, Heathkit sold those things, and that's a serious violation of the National Electrical Code, because it has a fuse in both sides. It isn't polarized, so you don't know which side the neutral is. It could be either side. So if the fuse happened to blow in the side you had plugged into the wall that was neutral, then the fuse that survived would put the set at 115 volts above ground and be an electrocution hazard. So if you have one of those, I used to think they were nifty, but if you have one of those on any of your equipment, I'd take the dikes and cut it off.
Well, you could also just put a higher fuse on one side.
It was still not polarized, so you don't know which side's neutral and which side's hot.
Our cutters were.
Yeah. Oh, I'm on the wrong way, sorry. Oh, National didn't sell any speakers when they first came out with the HRO, but those were the later ones, and the ones for the HRO would have an output transformer mounted on the frame of the speaker. And some military ones, I know Steve has one that's got a heavier duty transformer mounted in the floor of the cabinet. And they all had what they call it, cloisonne, is that how you pronounce it? The NC diamond and the red background.
Cloisonne?
Cloisonne? Okay, my French is complete.
Pretty red stuff.
Anyway, if you're buying a speaker, it's very desirable to get one that still has the NC diamond on it, because a lot of them get bent or torn off or moved to something else.
So there are two sizes, 5 inch or 6 inch and 10 inch, or?
Those speakers, I think the one on the right is 10 inches, and I believe the one on the left's 12.
We've never seen a 12, though, except
No,
except J.O.N.'s house.
Yeah, I've never seen one like on the left.
I've seen an 8 inch, or maybe it's an 8
I've got a couple. Oh, there's an 8-inch one right over there behind the coils. The Coast Guard called their HRO senior an R105. The Army called the HROM R106, and the Brits called theirs R106. Incidentally, the Brits bought these things by the hundreds, if not thousands, during World War II. I don't know why exactly, because they made decent radios, but I think it was the resettability of the dial when they were trying to copy all these German U-boats. They could go put the dial back to the right number, and they knew they'd be on the frequency.
What frequencies did the German U-boats operate on?
Oh, yeah.
All over, like 7 megs up.
That would have been a propagation matter, and depending on what time of day and probably which season of the year.
I see reports from 7 megacycles up through 20 megacycles. Yeah, yeah. The receiver, I have a U-boat receiver, and it goes up to 24.
We have of these. The HRO was probably the most popular receiver to ever have knockoffs made of it. Germans made knockoffs, the Japs made knockoffs, the Australians made knockoffs, probably with our agreement, and New Zealanders did. We have on the table up here one of all of these except the New Zealand. We've got the two of the Australians, the Kingsley and the Amalgamated Wireless, and the Cording.
Click through real quick, and then we can just come up.
Okay, that's the Kingsley. That's Brian's. He's a lucky guy that owns that.
That's actually Mears.
Oh, is that?
Yeah.
Well, you got one just like that.
I wish I did.
Okay.
They're really hot. They're actually very hot set. Very nice
Have
set.
many more slides on here?
Just a few.
I'm gonna have to wrap up soon.
Just a
Yeah,
few.
we've done.
Yeah. What's that? That's the AWA.
Yeah, that's the one I have, and it's down on the end. And
Okay.
it came in its own wooden carry transit case, which serves as the rack.
Yeah.
But I just got it laid over.
There's the New Zealand, which we don't have. There's the German, which is up here somewhere. The Japanese. And that's actually got the plug-in coil. It's kind of an HRO, not a.
Leonard said circuit-wise, that was an HRO. It just looks a little different on the outside.
Yeah, I want to thank Greg Gore for bringing stuff down here, the HES and the FB7s and the SW3s, and Meyer and Leonard for bringing their stuff. And Chris Dockery isn't here, but it's his
Actually, I
HRO6.
forgot to put it out. It's still.
Oh, well, there's an HRO6 over in the corner.
I might leave it there.
Yeah, probably a good idea. And John brought his shop order tea. Brian helped me with the slides immensely. If he hadn't helped me with the slides, I wouldn't have been able to do this. Henry Rogers, I want to give a special word of thanks, because if you haven't visited his internet site, it's priceless. And I got a lot of the HROs. In fact, I got interested in HROs from reading his site. And he graciously gave me permission to use any of the pictures from my slides. And so I've told you about all I know about HROs, probably a little bit more than that.